This is a 2006 Citroen C6, and it is a truly bizarre French luxury sedan. Throughout the 2000s, the C6 was the flagship luxury sedan from Citroen, who's known for making some very weird cars over the years, very much including this one. And today, I'm going to review the C6. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. Now with free listings, you can list your car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this beautiful Dodge Viper SRT10 Coupe, which sold for $62,000, this fantastic Ford Raptor, which brought $54,000, and this wonderful old school air-cooled Porsche 911 Cabriolet, which sold for $37,000. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. Check it out, daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. Now, the Citroen C6 was never sold in the United States, in North America, and there are probably only a few that have been imported here, so this is a hard car for me to find. But I've borrowed this C6 from the Lane Motor Museum here in Nashville, Tennessee. The Lane Motor Museum has an amazing collection of some fantastic cars, including this C6. You know a museum's great when they have the quirky stuff, and I highly recommend, if you're in Nashville and you like cars at all, take a visit to the Lane Motor Museum. You can check out the Lane Motor Museum by clicking the link in the description below. So let's talk C6. Now, Citroen is a French car company, and they are known for building some weird cars, as all of the French car companies are. The C6 was Citroen's flagship luxury car from 2005 to 2012, and it's about the size of a Toyota Avalon or a Mercedes E-Class, except much weirder. In fact, weird is what this car is known for. So much weird, in fact, that it had trouble selling because most luxury sedan shoppers wanted something a little bit more traditional and a little bit less, well, French. Now, the C6 was famously used by presidents of France, but it failed to meet sales expectations, and it was never a major success. But it's certainly quirky, and that means I must review it. So today, I am going to review the C6, one of the weirdest modern French cars. First, I'll take you on a tour of it and show you all of the many quirks and features of the C6. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give the C6 a DOUGSCORE. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the C6 on the inside, which is actually a difficult decision because the outside of this car is so bizarre. Look at this rear end styling. What is going on back here? This is so strange and weird. What the heck? But I will get to that in a minute, because as quirky as it is out there, it is just as quirky in here. For example, the door panel. In your car, you probably have a little storage pocket on your door. You can toss something in while you're driving. In this car, you have a storage pocket behind this half-circle wood door, which opens downward. You pull on this handle, and this half-circle opens down, revealing a hidden storage pocket, and then you can put your stuff in there. And when you're done, you can close this up again, and then you have like a hidden little storage cubby in your door panel. So you do have a storage pocket in there, but it's behind a half circle, like fake wood door. That is weird. And the weirdness continues as you move into this car. You can see the steering wheel has a very large centerpiece horn pad airbag area, and that means you can't get too many controls onto the steering wheel spokes. You only have your cruise controls here. But you're thinking, but this is a luxury car. It would be nice to have audio controls on the steering wheel as well. Well, they sort of did that. The driver audio controls are on this stalk coming off the steering column. So in your car, you have a stalk for the windshield wipers and the turn signals. Here, you have a third stalk for the audio controls, and you can see like a next track button, previous track. You can scroll through different menus, and there are two buttons behind for volume that can go up or down. So all of your audio controls for the driver are on this stalk, just like the wipers or the turn signals panels in any other normal car. Very interesting little quirk. And speaking of interesting quirks in here, how about the cup holders, which are very hidden? You look around, you don't see any immediately obvious ones. That's because they are stored vertically in the center control stack. You press this little silver line and the cup holder pops out and then like unfurls itself, and there you can place your cup. Same deal over on the passenger side. This hidden vertical panel reveals the cup holder. A very interesting and quirky oddball placement. And next up, another fantastic quirk in here is the center console. Now in most cars, you just pull on a little tab, you lift it up, and there's storage in there. In this car, there are 3 little tabs that you can pull on. You can choose which one, and they all do different quirky things. The tab over on the left opens up this center armrest so you can put stuff in the storage area. Pretty simple. The tab over on the right opens up a smaller center storage area, sort of in the center storage lid, so you can put smaller items in here. So you have 2 separate storage areas. Meanwhile, the tab in the center actually raises up this center storage area lid so that it can be an armrest. So you can have the armrest in its normal position or pull that center tab and it's in a higher position if that's more comfortable. So you have 3 different options for your quirky center storage area lid. And next up, speaking of storage, to the left of the steering wheel, you have this little panel here with a latch. You open it and you have a small storage area over here, which is kind of interesting and quirky. You don't see that too often. Also in this area, you can see a note for an airbag. That's because this car has a knee airbag, which is a pretty cool feature. You get into an accident, obviously you want to prevent your head from hitting the steering wheel, and that's why there's an airbag on the wheel, but you also want to prevent your knees from hitting the dashboard, and so a knee airbag does that. A pretty cool touch and pretty advanced for 2006. And next up, since this is a French car, there's a lot of cigarette lighting and ashtraying going on in this car. You have a cigarette lighter right in the center here, in the center console, and you have a rather large ashtray at the bottom of the center control stack where you can put your ashes. You also have another ashtray over on the passenger side door panel. There is a passenger specific ashtray in here just in case the driver's ashtray is full, because people are smoking so much in this car, as you might expect from France from this time period. And next up, another interesting quirk of this car is the climate vents. At first glance, they look like fairly normal climate vents, but their movement is a little odd. To move them up and down, you have this little wheel on the side. You move it and you can see the vents are going up or down. To move them side to side, you have a little wheel on the bottom. You move that and it switches them from side to side. Pretty standard, but how do you close them? Most cars have like a little wheel you can turn them off if you don't want air blowing on you. In this car, that little wheel is located on the top of the dashboard by the infotainment screen. This little wheel right here is what you use to control airflow from these vents, and you only have 1 wheel per side of the interior. So the driver vents are controlled by this wheel and the passenger vents are controlled by this wheel, and you can't shut off individual climate vents, which is kind of odd. And next up, another interesting quirk with that infotainment screen at the top of the dashboard. You can move the angle of the screen to however you want, depending on like the lighting or your seating position or whatever. You just press these little buttons to the left side of the screen and you can see the screen angle actually moves corresponding to the button presses to perfectly align with however you want the screen angle to be. You don't see that too often in a lot of cars. And speaking of screens in this car, it's worth noting you do not have a traditional gauge cluster in here. Instead, you have a gauge screen directly ahead of the steering wheel. You can see it right here. Fairly straightforward, not all that quirky, except for the fact that it's quirky just by being a screen rather than traditional gauges, but it shows your speedometer, your tachometer, warning lights, mileage odometer, that sort of thing, all in your gauge cluster screen. Now, above the gauge screen, you have a heads-up display, which would have been pretty impressive for 2006 for this car, and you can see it's located right here, and it's giving the speed right now. You have some controls for the heads-up display to the left of the steering wheel. You can change the brightness, the position, and you can change the display, although you only have 2 options. You can choose between the speed and the navigation directions. That's it. I mean, you can't have them both displaying at once. That's all you get. Kind of a rudimentary heads-up display compared to what we're used to now, but for 15 years ago, that was a pretty cool quirk. Now, despite all of these screens and all of this modern technology in this car, you still have a center control stack that is amazingly overcomplicated and filled with buttons and switches. I counted 58 total buttons on this center control stack. Remember this the next time you say cars shouldn't have screens, well then you're gonna end up with something like this, except maybe even more complicated. It's just kind of overkill with buttons and switches and knobs in here. Now with that said, there are some rather interesting buttons in here, as you might imagine. There's one that's marked dark. If you press that once, the infotainment screen in the center turns off. It goes dark for kind of a less stressful, screenless driving experience. If you press dark a second time, all of the screens go dark with the exception of just your speedometer in the center of the gauge cluster. Everything else, the gauge screen, your heads-up display, it's all off, so you just have your speedometer. If you want like a nice, relaxing nighttime drive and you don't want all these screens to be glowing in your face, you have your little dark button. That's kind of cool. Another rather cool button here is this one down near the bottom, a car with lane lines on either side. That's the lane departure warning button, which is amazing for a car from 2006. This must have been one of the first cars that had that feature. Of course, if you turn it on, it will monitor the lane lines and let you know if you're starting to drift out of them. Very commonplace today for a car to have lane departure warning, but very cutting edge back in 2006. But probably the most bizarre button in this giant button-filled center control stack would be the door lock button, which is hidden almost out of place, down and to the left, right here, parked next to the traction control off button, and the same size as that. You can't really tell where the door locks are in this car. You go to unlock the door to let someone in, you're searching around the door panel, the center, well actually it's buried in this button array, and you wouldn't really find it unless you know to look for it there. Now, one other interesting item to note in this giant button area here is that some of the buttons near the top control the screen. This is not a touch screen in the center here. Instead, you press like audio to pull up your audio menu, you press nav to pull up your navigation menu, and then you can use this center controller and these arrows to kind of scroll around and enter various things. So this is kind of a rudimentary early screen setup. It's not exactly as easy as modern touchscreens, but there's a screen there nonetheless, and that's how you control it with all of these buttons. By the way, one other wonderful quirk I have noticed while driving this car, if you drive without a seatbelt on, it gives you a little warning chime telling you to buckle up. Of course, take a listen. But if you continue to drive without a seatbelt on, the warning chime gets louder. Take a listen. And if you drive even more without the seatbelt on, the warning chime gets louder still. Take a listen. Now, at this point, I got scared and I put my seatbelt on, but you gotta wonder, if you kept driving, would it just get louder and louder until it completely overtakes you and it forces you to put your seatbelt on with noise? It might. I've never really seen that though, an increasingly loud seatbelt chime making very sure you know you should buckle up. And next up we move on to the back of the C6. The first thing you notice back here is it is nice and roomy. You have good leg room, good knee room back here. You can really spread out. No surprise, of course, like I said, this was Citroen's flagship luxury sedan in the 2000s. Jacques Chirac used one of these, Nicolas Sarkozy, presidents of France, and so you wanted a lot of space back here. It was a luxury car, although it is worth noting headroom is robbed just a little bit. I don't have a ton of headroom because of the design of this car, sort of this teardrop sloping roof shape. It's a little bit less headroom than you might expect from a luxury sedan, but you gotta make some sacrifices in the name of style. Now, probably the quirkiest quirk you will notice when you climb back here is there are 4 seatbelt buckles. Of course, the 2 normal ones, but then there's 2 other seatbelt buckles. So what exactly is going on here? And also, as you investigate more, where is the middle seatbelt? You don't see it anywhere in here. Where did they hide it? Well, I'll tell you the answers to those questions. The middle belt is here, under this little cover behind the headrest on the rear shelf. You pop open the cover and you can see the belt, and you can also see there are 2 like belt buckly clippy things. So how does this work exactly? Aha, here's what you do. The first little buckly clippy thing is brought across the chest of the middle seat passenger and buckled into buckle number 1. Then the second buckle is brought across the lap of the middle seat passenger and buckled in to buckle number 2. And that way you get a 3-point belt in here, which is of course what you want for safety, but they come to it in a kind of strange way with 2 buckles and a little weird middle seat belt. But it works, and it's probably safer than just a lap belt. But anyway, next up, moving on to the rest of the rear seat quirks, how about the fact that once again you have individual ashtrays, one on both rear doors, one for one rear passenger and one for the other, and individual rear seat cigarette lighters back here. Of course, on the center console you have one for one side and one for the other, so everybody in this car can smoke and then put their cigarette ashes into individual separate ashtrays. So wonderfully French, of course. Now, another nice feature back here, you have climate control. You have 2 climate vents for the rear seats, and you can adjust the climate control, though it's worth noting you can't adjust the temperature, just the fan speed and the placement of the air. But you do have a cool graphic. You can see as you change the fan speed, it like increases the amount of lights that are on in this fan, which I find to be nice and quirky, but that's your rear seat climate control in the C6. Now, next up, another interesting quirk back here, you do have a rear sunshade in the C6, although it is not power operated like in some cars where you push a button and it kind of whirs up to block out the sun. Instead, it's this manual thing. You have to like unlatch it and then unclip it, and then you can push it down if you want the sun, or you kind of pull it into place and have to clip it into place if you want the sunshade to be up. Makes it a little bit harder, more unwieldy than most rear sunshades, but at least you have that for a little shade in the back of the C6. And finally, one other fantastic quirk back here is the door panel storage pockets in back. You have the same wood-trimmed half circle that you pull down, and then you can put your stuff in the little door panel, and then you can put the door pocket back up. Very bizarre, probably the strangest door panel storage door I've ever seen, but that's what the C6 has. No surprise from a quirky French car. And next up, I'm gonna move outside the C6. I'm gonna start with the rear end. I know you've all been waiting for this, and I have too, because what exactly is going on back here? I'm gonna break down this unusual design. Okay, the taillight assembly is one of the strangest parts, no question. Very odd. It has this curved design over the back of the car and then extends out over to the side. A really strange taillight. And stranger still is how it operates. The brake light is only this little piece on the inside. That's the only brake light back here, despite this massive assembly. Now, the turn signal is even stranger. It's just this, which again is a rather small piece considering how large this assembly is and how much orange you have in here. So you may be wondering, what exactly is the rest of this orange for if it's not the turn signal? And the answer is, it's a running light. When the headlights are on and thus the taillights are on, this piece just lights up orange on the side. It doesn't blink with the turn signal. It just lights up as a running light in back. I am not exactly sure why they felt an orange side-mounted running light would be a good idea, but that's what this car has, and that helps explain the weirdness of this taillight assembly. But honestly, I'm not even sure the taillight assembly is the quirkiest thing about the back of this car. That honor might go to the rear window, which you can see is flat along the top, but like U-shaped along the bottom, basically curved inside towards the interior in the back seats. Now, Citroen claims that this rear window design helps keep rainwater off the back window. By shaping it this way, the rain like doesn't attach itself to the rear window as much as a flat back window, and so that's why they do this. Not actually sure if it works, but I do know it probably creates a rather expensive piece of replacement glass if this should ever break. So that is definitely a quirk in the back of the C6. And the rear quirks still aren't done. Now, this car has a teardrop shape with a sloping rear roofline, so you gotta figure this hatchback opens up and it probably has a ton of cargo space back here, except actually, the hatchback doesn't open at all. This car has a trunk. Even though it has that teardrop shape, it has a traditional trunk in back, which again is very strange and quirky. Now, this trunk is very large. Just like you may have guessed, you can get a lot of stuff back here. Big car, big trunk, but it's a rather small opening. Because you have this sloping rear roofline, it kind of robs some of the trunk opening space, and so big trunk, small opening, and yet another quirk of the Citroen C6. And the quirks in back are still coming. You put the trunk down and you'll notice there are a few like lines on it, almost like it splits into different parts. Well, not actually different parts, that's a spoiler. The C6 has an active trunk mounted spoiler that will appear at certain speeds like you would have on a Porsche 911 Turbo. Now, this is a front wheel drive car and no version was ever made with more than 240 horsepower. I think that an active rear spoiler is kind of overkill, but it's Citroen, it's the French, they are weird. and so you have a trunk spoiler that deploys at speed. And since we're talking weird things in the C6, let's talk suspension. This car has a hydro-pneumatic suspension system, which is a rather complicated system, and I don't want to get into the technical details, but it's basically a hydraulic system that's very different from standard steel spring suspension you'd get in most cars. And while serviceability and reliability are certainly drawbacks of hydro-pneumatic suspension, there are some benefits, namely an excellent ride quality and self-leveling, meaning the car will stay level no matter how much weight you put inside it, and you can also adjust the ride height. You have these little buttons here in the center console. You can press up or down and that will change the height. So you press down and you can see the car kind of squats down to a lower position. You would do this if you want to go fast for better aerodynamics, or if you want to make the car lower to make it easier to get inside. You can also press up and then the car, you can see, starts to raise itself up, and it actually gets unusually high. You can see in its highest suspension setting, it's kind of doing an SUV or crossover impression, and that would be what you would use the high setting for if you're on like a rough road or terrain in your C6 and you want a little more ground clearance. You can do that thanks to the hydro-pneumatic suspension. Very strange, but a very typical Citroen quirk. And next up, still on the outside of the C6, I want to talk front end design, and to do that, I actually want to start with the back end, which you can see is very abrupt. There is basically no rear overhang behind the rear wheel, very abrupt short back end. Well, it's quite the opposite up front, where you have a very long reaching front end, kind of a strange contrast compared to the back, certainly an unusual design for this unusual car. And just in case the long front end design wasn't quite quirky enough for you, how about the grille, which isn't actually a grille. Instead, it's two sort of silver lines across the front end, and then they point up in the center to make the Citroen logo, and that actually cuts into the hood shape. But what a cool and clever way to do it. It's sort of like a disguised grille that also has the manufacturer emblem in it. Probably the coolest way I've ever seen to install a manufacturer emblem on the front of the car, and I love that neat little trick. Now, speaking of that design, it's also seen on the wheels. In the center, this little cap that covers the lug nuts has this same design. These sort of two silver lines that point up at the top to create the Citroen logo. Obviously, that is intended to recall the grille of this car, and they have it on the wheels too. Kind of cool. And next up, another interesting quirk up here is the headlights, which again have a rather unusual design to them. Not as strange as the back, but you still have this sort of small front that kind of sweeps into the middle and into the fender of the car, which is definitely distinctive. Now you can see when the headlights are on, a part of it is orange, and of course that would be the turn signal, except that it isn't. Once again, the turn signal is down on the bottom, like in the bumper. This is just an orange running light that's on as the car drives along. So you actually have orange lights front and rear in this car. Certainly a rather unusual quirk to the C6. And finally, we move under the hood of the C6, and you can see the engine under here. This car has a gas-powered V6, which made about 200 horsepower. Not exactly a huge figure, but that's what it had. The C6 was also offered with two different diesel engine options, a 4-cylinder or a V6 diesel. The V6 made around 240 horsepower, but none of them were very muscular engines. That wasn't really the point of this car. It wasn't intended to be like a sporty performance luxury car. It was like a luxurious, comfortable touring type car. And so you had relatively calm, kind of understated engines, not really powerful, fast ones. One other interesting quirk in the engine bay, you can see this little label that shows a guy with a power washer and then an X saying, "Don't do this." Just a reminder not to power wash your engine bay. In case you were thinking about doing that, that's not something that you should do. Thanks for that warning label, Citroen. Very, very helpful information. Now I won't power wash the engine of my car. They ought to stick one of those in the interior, or else someone might try to power wash that too. And so those are the many quirks and features of the Citroen C6. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the C6 with the knowledge that I am probably the only person in North America who is doing this right now, which is so cool. Now, as you probably know, the United States has a law saying that cars cannot be imported here from other countries privately until they are 25 years old. This car is only 15 years old, but institutions like the Lane Motor Museum have an exemption for, museum and educational activities. So if we want our under 25-year-old cars, I guess we need to get a museum going or something. So driving this car, first thing you notice, it's comfortable. This hydropneumatic suspension, it had a few interesting benefits, like the self-leveling and being able to raise or lower. But a lot of people just think, oh, the only benefit of hydropneumatic suspension is it's more comfortable. Well, it certainly is more comfortable, even though there are other advantages to it as well. And I'm on some bumpy roads here, and it's handling it well. Now, the drawback is it kind of wallows a little bit. You kind of feel like there's body roll and that sort of thing because the car feels soft. But that was the intent. These cars were aimed at people who wanted sort of a softer, not sporty, but kind of a more luxurious luxury car experience. And that suspension was intended to help deliver that. It is surprisingly quiet inside this car. Sitting here at a traffic light, you're really not hearing much going on out in the world. It feels nice and relaxing in here. This is kind of a mix between like a true luxury car and sort of a mid-level luxury car. Citroen isn't really a true luxury brand, and this car wasn't like powerful like a Mercedes, like a top-end E-Class, but it had some of the luxury characteristics like a very soft ride and the fact that you don't really hear that much going on outside. This was the luxury car for people who truly wanted luxury and not like, any form of sportiness. But the issue was it was also just not that strong of a brand name. At the end of the day, even in Europe, Citroen, it's just not a luxury mark. They also make cheap economy cars to an extent. And as a result, this was a bit of a tough sell. And it wasn't just that. I mean, the styling was too quirky, the rear end, like I said, French presidents drove this vehicle, but that wasn't enough to make people think that it was really a very luxurious car. I will say though, driving it on the road, I am impressed with the ride quality. It's wafty. It feels unusually comfortable, way more than most other luxury vehicles, especially at this price point, because this was cheaper than like an E-Class or a 5 Series, but it has the ride of like a S-Class to an extent. It is very supple. Now, the drawback to that, like I mentioned, comes when you want some performance out of the car. I'm flooring it right now. You're just not getting all that much. It was tuned for, a supple, luxurious experience and not a performance-y one. Interestingly, the steering itself is actually relatively quick, but the handling is the real issue. The car wallows when it goes around corners. It has some body roll. There's a lot of suspension travel. It's not stiff suspension intended to keep the car like planted and go hard around a corner. It wasn't their intent, and it's not how it turned out. And that's fine for the people who bought the car, but you're not getting anything sporty with this vehicle. Obviously, Citroen doesn't sell cars in the United States, and they haven't for a long time, but I actually think this car probably would have done pretty well in the States back in the mid-2000s. As a big sedan, as like a Chevy Impala type car, Toyota Avalon type rival, this is an appealing car. It drives better than an Avalon. I think the styling would have been a bit of a daring move for a lot of Americans, just like it was for a lot of Europeans. I mean, this car really did never hit sales targets and kind of ended its production run a failure. I will say though, from a quirky and interesting car-loving perspective, this was, a lot of people consider this to be sort of the last true Citroen, in the sense that it had the hydropneumatic suspension, it had the weird styling. This car was already kind of going more towards a normal thing. The interior is more normal in here than prior Citroen models. But since this car, they have really gone more normal, more mainstream in the pursuit of more global sales and not just success in France. And a lot of people kind of consider this to be sort of the swan song of old school Citroen to an extent. And it's neat to be able to check it out here in the United States. Lane Motor Museum, some amazing cars. I can't believe they have one of these. And so that's the Citroen C6. Jacques Chirac, Nicolas Sarkozy, and not very many others. It's a cool luxury car, but it's also a weird luxury car. And unless you're into weird cars, you're probably just gonna get a 5 Series. But I am into weird cars, and I was thrilled to have the chance to spend the day with the C6 and all its quirkiness. And now it's time to give the C6 a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Citroen C6 is, well, it's odd, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Acceleration 0 to 60 is in the low 8-second range, which gives it a 1 out of 10. Handling is okay. It's intended for more comfort than handling prowess, but it's acceptable given its age and size, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is low. The real fun comes from driving such an unusual vehicle, especially here in the States, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and while this may not be true globally, the C6 is really cool here, especially since this is likely the only one in America America. It gets a 6 out of 10, which is an excellent score for a 2000 sedan, and it ends up with a weekend score of 18 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The C6 is reasonably well equipped, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Comfort is excellent, especially for a fairly mainstream car, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Quality is okay. The interior is fine, though not exceptional, and reliability is only average. It gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are relatively inexpensive. In Europe, they're just treated as sort of normal used cars, and Citroens do tend to depreciate quickly. Still, it's kind of a bargain for what it is if you can get past the styling, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 29 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 47 out of 100, which places the C6 here against some other relevant cars, dead last. Although these cars aren't really a good match. Most are either too luxurious, like the Maybach and the Toyota Century, or too new or too performancy. The C6 is unusual, both among cars I've reviewed and, well, just overall. This? What is this? What am I doing here?